Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation. I'd like to open our event by inviting all of you to do what you're already doing. Say hello in the chat. We are loving seeing where you are, where you're watching from, and what's on your mind. So thank you for wonderfully populating that chat. And I'm very excited to welcome you to today's conversation about the vibrant and richly complex place that is the US-Mexico borderlands, La Frontera. It is a place where many of today's most pressing issues are brought to bear, and of course, a region of deep, deep histories. Artists, cultural practitioners, scholars, community leaders have long brought forth very, very expansive ideas, very complex ideas of what that culture is and what displacement and belonging mean. Across the border's 2,000-mile reach are communities in 4 current U.S. states and 6 Mexican ones, 154 Native American tribes and 25 Native American nations. At least 7 indigenous homelands and peoples are intersected by the border's cartographical construct. It is a space that, to quote the great Gloria Anzaldúa, was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. And in thinking about this conversation today, I went back to a starting place for me, Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderland La Frontera, and just to read a little bit more. This is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire, but the skin of the earth is seamless. The sea cannot be fenced. El mar does not stop at borders. And so much more in that extraordinary sacred text, I think. Immigrants and refugees from Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, and parts of Asia encounter the border daily in their efforts to reach the United States. Thousands more cross the border in both directions for their work, their families, their communities. It is a physical barrier that represents centuries of racialized policies and policing and remains an ongoing site of separation. In negotiating and resisting reductive and divisive conceptions of the border, many have reshaped the borderlands as a place of collective action and creative expression and experimentation. And here, the humanities offers an especially strong and illuminating lens through which to better see and come to understand this region in an ongoing way. So with us to discuss their powerful creative and research practices and the power of the humanities in the US-Mexico borderlands are Natalie Diaz, Fauna Forman, and Teddy Cruz. By way of brief introduction, Natalie Diaz is a poet, language activist, and educator. She is Mojave born and raised on the banks of the Colorado River in the Fort Mojave Indian Village and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community. She has written 2 extraordinary poetry collections, other sacred texts for me and so many others, When My Brother Was an Aztec, which won an American Book Award, and Post-Colonial Love Poem, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. In 2020, she founded the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University, where she is also the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall Chair in Modern and Contemporary Poetry, and among many other honors, she is a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship. Natalie, we're so happy that you could join us. Welcome.
Gracias for having me.
Fauna Forman and Teddy Cruz are principals of Estudio Teddy Cruz and Fauna Forman, a research-based political and architectural practice in San Diego. Their work emphasizes urban conflict and informality as sites of intervention for rethinking public policy and civic infrastructure, with a special emphasis on Latin American cities. Fauna is renowned for her research on the intersection of ethics, public culture, urban policy, and the city, with a special focus on climate justice and equitable urbanization. And Teddy is internationally recognized for his urban and architectural research of the San Diego-Tijuana border. They are both professors at UC San Diego, Fauna in political science, and Teddy in public culture and urbanism in visual arts, where they also lead the university's Center on Global Justice. Together, they form the UCSD community stations, which make up a network of field stations on both sides of the San Diego-Tijuana border and are places for engaged research and teaching on poverty and social equity. Their work is fascinating. Welcome, Fauna and Teddy. We're so pleased to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to open our conversation with a very broad kind of ground setting question for the three of you as we ground ourselves in the potential vastness of this conversation. Could you each please start by briefly contextualizing the land on which and with which you work? How would you start off to talk about that?
I'm joining you all from one of my homelands. So I work at Arizona State University. I am on Akimel Atam, one of my tribes, and also Peepash homelands. A lot of my work also centers on the reservation I grew up on, the Fort Mojave Indian Reservation. We call Hakulo. It's right on the Colorado River. And both of those communities have built my imagination of language, land, water, what is art, what I think of in terms of mentorship, relationality. I grew up on a reservation in which my neighbors were also my family. And I think another thing that kind of shapes the way that I enter into any conversation I arrive at is that Hamakav, which is the name we call ourselves in Mojave, means the river runs through the middle of our body, that being the Colorado River, one of the most endangered rivers of the United States. And then also that Akimel Atam, which is the Atam nation I am from, is in reference to Ankh Akimel, or the Rio Salado, or the Salt River. So I come from two river peoples. And so that's one of the things I'm always carrying with me as we think about this particular borderlands, the U.S.-Mexico border, and the ways that it, in some ways, is the river, is the ocean, as well as the ancient ocean.
Elizabeth, in our case, we live and work in the Tijuana, San Diego region. Is one of the largest binational metropolitan regions in the world. We often say that in no other place in the planet we can find some of the wealthiest real estate as the one found in the edges of San Diego, barely 20 minutes away from some of the poorest and most precarious informal settlements in Latin America and in the world. So this radical proximity of wealth and poverty, this regional and urban asymmetry is really what has motivated our work very much, asking the question, how do we tackle inequality? And obviously, all of that is manifested and physicalized in the 30-foot high border wall that is in short distance from our campus. So it's unavoidable that we need to confront that. And often, we tend to take our students across a journey through the territory, because while we are focusing on the wall, or at least at times engage it as a prompt, as a detonator, we always say that border is invisibly reproduced across the border cities, across a variety of urban conflicts where the top-down forces of urbanization collide with social and ecological bottom-up dynamics. And we would love to take you on that journey, because, begins in northern San Diego, again, in some of these most wealthiest real estate, but really out of the conflict between top-down urbanization and bottom-up topography, the conflict between formal urbanization and informal dynamics in migrant neighborhoods, the conflict between the border wall, in fact, in the Tijuana River, which is really about the splintering of the indigenous territories or nation of the Kumeyaay. And at the end of our journey, we would arrive at probably one of the most dramatic conflicts, where the border wall finally sinks into the Pacific Ocean, which we always call it as the conflict between the political and the natural. In essence, urban conflict really for us is a creative tool. We argue that the arts and humanities need to reposition themselves in the midst of each of those collisions to retool ourselves.
And just to add a little bit about the topography and the territory, our region is a system of canyons that unite us inside of a watershed that is truncated by an artificial sort of barrier. And this barrier has created unimaginable environmental havoc on this region. And so one of the things we like to do is imagine the canyon systems operating without that obstruction, and returning to the natural hydrologies of the region. Another thing, you asked about proximities and sort of where we're situated. Our proximity to Central America and the northbound migratory flows that are accelerating because of the impacts of climate change on the natural environment. I mean, this is just a profound and increasingly important dimension of life here in our region.
Thank you all. And so to this word that we're going to work with, the border, this word that contains more than we could possibly cover today. The big question is how do you define it? Historically, literally, imaginatively, aspirationally, radically? How do you define the border?
I can begin for a moment saying,
Please, yes.
we discussed the wall as a physical manifestation of inequality because for us inequality is really an institutional violence on human dignity. And in a sense, for us, again, the wall as a detonator, we have always seen it as a self-inflicted wound. Just as Fonna was saying, well, it's seemingly understood generally by the American public as an artifact of security. Is really about environmental and social insecurity, which undermines our own resources. So it's really about a violent blow on our environmental and social shared resources and common interests. Often we also equate it, and probably from the vantage point of architecture and urbanization, as a physicalization of fear, of an urbanism of fear, on a division and polarization, as the city continues to develop itself as an archipelago of isolated environments. And so there are many, obviously, metaphors that are really triggering a set of actions in our work. And maybe one that is most important, probably, is one that an artist friend of ours shared, an artist from Tijuana, who once said that the wall exists only to be transgressed. And isn't that the ultimate aspiration of art, he said, to transgress our own fears, our own conventions? And so I think that ultimately it is this, the wall becomes a kind of detonator for linking what has been separated. And I think that in this case is very much about the division of theory and practice, of our aspirations and what we end up, possibly enacting. So something that Carlos Monsiváis once said very beautifully too, that the wall is a portable wall, because it really represents the divorce between what we aspire to do and what we end up ultimately doing. And so, yes, it is a detonator in our work.
And I think something to as you're talking about metaphors, right? Like we have all of these metaphors, even the detonator, for example, which is interesting, having seen the Gadsden Purchase is what separated the O'odham Nation. So it's what cut Tohono O'odham. It made Tohono O'odham Nation half Mexico, half United States. But even to have watched that wall go up, have seen them dynamite it up Monument Hill to continue putting the wall in toward that last Trump push. But in relationship to the metaphor and to language, there is no word for wall in the O'odham language. And I think that's a really important way of thinking before and beyond it, and what that means of the imagination. If you can't even verbalize or express in spoken language what the thing is, what does that free of your imagination, and what is that disrupting of the imagination? And there are 62 miles, more or less, of international border that run through the Tohono O'odham Nation. And I think something that is important for us here is that, and thinking of you all's work as well, is that the border itself is an object. It's a man-made object, like you're saying. It's portable, and it's not where life is happening. It's designed to be the disruption to those relationships, whether that's animals migrating, or the fact that the Atham Nation could cross to see family without going through a border fence. And something I think that is really compelling to me about not just the way our human species is transgressing, I'll use that, that language that you're offering us, transgressing the wall, but recently in Oregon Pipe National Forest, they had to introduce gates. So they built gates into the wall because the floodwaters would come, and once that rain hit the washes, the water and land have a long relationship that began long before the wall. And so that water moved in such a way that it was threatening the stability of the wall. And so they had to come in at the end and add gates into the border wall for the water, which is so ironic. I mean, at least ironic, right? That people cannot cross, but they were willing to build a gate. And I'm talking especially for those who might not know the area on the Teal Reservation, the Sonora Desert. It's part of that corridor that was designed in prevention through deterrence, to push migrants into the most dangerous part of the desert to cross as a way to deter them from crossing.
Natalie, that's fantastic. This idea of the transgressive gate, I mean, what it shows is that the idea of transgressing the wall is not a normative concept, but a description of the way life goes on every day: air, water, waste, and cultural aspirations and hope and justice and love and all of these things that move back and forth every day. I mean, the official narratives about our region is that we're a place of closure, of disruption, of partition, where things don't move. And one thing that was so wonderful about your introduction, Elizabeth, was this idea that things don't stop here. Might stop in the imagination or in the perceptions that people have outside. But one of the things that we are really committed to doing here, and I hear this in Natalie's narrative as well, is to create counter narratives from the voices of people who actually inhabit this zone, and to sort of reclaim our own narratives and our own histories of the border. Like, if you look back at the history, 19th and early 20th century history of the border wall, it was simply a kind of line in the sand. People moved back and forth. But as it became militarized and thickened and heightened and widened, it became more like a partition. But it doesn't really operate that way, the way life goes on here.
Elizabeth, can I mention something, just following something that Natalie said that is very essential, because that's really what I wanted to convey. Obviously, I began by talking about maybe some metaphorical interpretations of what the wall ultimately suggests. But what I was trying to say is that we need to at times stop seeing it as an artifact in order to unveil and really unearth and really make relevant the life as lived across the many migrant neighborhoods, where bottom-up practices of survival, where solidarity and empathy, where collaboration with new formulations about how those strategies of survival can inspire us to rethink the city at large. And so it's about a more dynamic system. Metaphors sometimes can be fixed as images, and that's what we criticize here. We need to engage a more performative dimension, the operative processes embedded in everyday life and their practices. That's what we have been focusing our work.
And to push further on the question of history, I think it would be great to thinking also about this moment in contested U.S. history, contested what's taught in schools, book banning, the whole zone of how race and history can and cannot be taught in certain areas. and also folding in the way in which there's the history as we receive it in books, but also the history that when people themselves talk about, as you just did, Natalie, when this happened, the before time, this was when it changed. This is what I remember. Could you each just give us a few historical anchor moments that it would be important for folks to know about?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's really compelling, and for those of us here who like watch some of the Mellon conversations about the monument, and so rather than do dates, I think I'm just going to kind of do a little bit of a broader context. But this is
Yes.
one of the most terrible, but so traditional U.S. monument that has continued undisrupted in many ways. And I think something that, kind of linking toward these conversations about monuments and taking down colonial and settler colonial monuments, I think something that's really compelling is, and you mentioned this, Elizabeth, in the introduction, is that there aren't just Mexicans crossing the border or Central and South Americans crossing the border. This is the most frequently crossed border in the world, the US-Mexico border. And the fact that one of the largest populations several times across the last few years has been the population were migrants from Africa, from South Asia. And I think that is a kind of shift that we're able to talk with people about and show people right now to bring these conversations, to bear in the ways we're thinking about what migration means. And I guess maybe, again, this isn't a very specific date, but the fact that migration is now linked to immigrant and that it's been dislocated from the very natural movements of people and land and happening, and that it is a way of moving that was given to us by the land. Our language migrates, and the way that migration has been criminalized. I think there's something very interesting right now in language, and some of the work you all are doing in policy, I think is so extremely important. But like that migration has become criminalized. It's become something almost unnatural to our human movement, and this idea of safety and security. And so I guess I'm thinking maybe less in terms of like particular dates, but trends and shifts that are happening right now. And especially coming from a language standpoint, I think one of the ways I'm thinking of time or markers is that one of the most dangerous, as a poet, one of the most dangerous poetics is the poetics of law, and how those languages are carried. So all of the words we use for migration and migrants, how those are being deployed in policy from the city level to the state level to the Supreme Court level. So but it's kind of like I guess I'm kind of flexing outward with the question, but I think I'm thinking about those things. What exactly even do we mean by migration and how that has shifted over time, and some of the ways we're holding that in relationship to what we feel like are markers and moments and monuments of the way our society is moving.
Typical of other territories across the world, in fact, of the formation of the city that is basically, emerges from a history of contested power relations. I mean, often when we talk to our students about this, the border is this trivial, I'm sorry to say, but it's arbitrary line that has constantly been fluctuating as we speak, in fact. And often students get very surprised when we tell them that already by the middle of the 19th century, the border was not there. It was really up north, somewhere around Fresno. And then the mutation of these boundaries and borders. And when we talk to our partners in the Kumeyaay tribe here in San Diego, Mike Connolly, who reminds us of the Kumeyaay territory, which is the most amazing, obviously, cross-border, for that matter, condition, because it has always been organized around water and the natural sort of dynamics of the ecologies and the habitat. So the border is really ultimately a very precarious kind of concept that is constantly mutating. When we looked at the Kumeyaay nation, for example, and how it began to be splintered by, in fact, those power relations, colonization from the west because of the missions and the ranches, and then from the east by the flow of new settlers, and incrementally the Kumeyaay territory begins to become an archipelago of very small areas. And those themselves have internal borders, almost inland. So it is a very complex mosaic of compartmentalization and reaction and pushing out and back. So the border is constantly fluctuating. And that's the reason I think when a community is splintered by the very power of jurisdictional imposition, that requires us to really reenact a sense of agency, I think. And that's what really we often discuss with our partners. How do we then begin to push back at that compartmentalization?
Well, and something that's interesting too, just in terms of relationality, the Kumeyaay, we say Kamiya, they're our cousins. We share the same creation mountain, which is, would be north up the Colorado River. And so, like even just for example, one beautiful thing about thinking about migration is we have an important word in Mojave, very important because it's the way you would call a beloved, and it's muhan. And in the Kamiya language or the Kumeyaay language, it's the same. So to imagine that our migration patterns are carrying also with it those imaginings of how we might love one another. But yeah, just a small anecdotal thing that I think, also exemplifies what is carried in migration that we, again, often try to dislocate from, the human body of life and possibility.
I want to turn to some of the specific amazing work that that all of you are leading within the Borderlands with the question, what does your work explore? Who does it engage? And what do you hope to achieve? And Fauna and Teddy, I know you have some beautiful visuals for us.
Well, we can try to summarize it. I mean, there is always this very complex as a process, but after periods of criminalization of the border and of polarization of the border, we have really been working on creating a more permanent, more embedded, more rooted set of collaborations across the border as a site of interdependence and coexistence. And so we set up a network of sanctuary spaces, we can call them, a network of field stations located in low-income, often migrant neighborhoods, where education and research is conducted collaboratively with grassroots organizations, linking the resources and knowledges of both the university and communities, creating circulations between those communities into the campus and back. What has been interesting is that this project, this infrastructure of partnerships to begin with, because this is about the university and community partnering in the long term. It is not only a collaborative model of education with communities, but also a model of co-development of actual places. I always think of a kind of place-based humanities for that matter. So these are actual physical spaces that we've discovered could be developed and owned by our community partners because the economic and programmatic power of our public university can become leverage for our grassroots organization partners to develop their own housing and public spaces. So this idea of linking education or understanding education in this case as an organizing sort of a structural system for development, for community and economic development has been very, very important for us. And I should say that this also becomes a model to bundle equity, the sweat equity of artists and architects, and the sweat equity of communities in terms of the programmatic agendas. And again, access to municipal lands that have been essential for us to work with government to really activate. So it's about bundling and aggregating a lot of those hidden resources in order to produce a new form of community development.
And just a note about our programming and actually what happens in these spaces with our students and our community partners. One of the things we're really trying to do is to illuminate the interdependencies across the wall and to create communication and flow and understanding and dialogue. We really are trying to rethink the idea of citizenship itself through dialogue, that it's not something that is determined by documents you carry in your pocket, but is identified through the interdependencies and shared aspirations of people who live in a civic space that's violently interrupted. So we're trying to create what we think of as a kind of cross-border res publica. We learned, we once did a wonderful project with Antanas Mocus, the legendary former mayor of Bogota, Colombia, who was trying to sort of stitch together a society that had been just shredded by violence and poverty. And he introduced us to this idea of a citizenship culture, that citizenship becomes a cultural experience. And what we try to do with our students and our partners in these spaces is what we call unwalling experiments through radical cartographies and different visualizations of the region without the wall, to recapture and reclaim our region from the bottom up. And so our students are, learning, whether they're coming from the sciences or the social sciences or the humanities, they're learning how to mobilize cultural tools to help increase awareness of these interdependencies.
May I add just one last
Of
point
course,
here,
yes.
just for a moment, because there's so much to say, but we've been interested in the spatialization of justice. Let's put it that way. That's the reason for us the project is about rethinking and reimagining public space. We believe that social justice really demands the redistribution of not only resources, but of knowledges. And that's what really has produced the community station model in terms of the circulation, but also the rethinking of public space itself, public space itself, because often we think of public space just as a mere project of beautification without really protocols or thinking about the protocols that would assure inclusion, that would assure the meeting of knowledges. And so I think at that point, our idea in the community stations, which has been really the most important part, is connecting the physical with the social, so that these spaces to function sustainable across time. They cannot just be beautiful spaces. And we were designing, hopefully, places that really are inspiring for youth, where people can see and say, that's where opportunity is, physically and visually. But we realize that they need to be injected with resources, with funding, with long-term curatorial projects that are really bringing the university and the community to co-curate programming and so on. So that's part of, obviously, where Mellon has been fundamental to this effort, because it is there where we begin to inject the programs and activities that are led by our students and our researchers in collaboration with youth, with community activists, and these spaces that are really active, and we are sure that they really become long-term projects. Otherwise, obviously, they are short-lived.
And what you're describing too is the really interesting challenge of building. Maybe we don't want to call it institutions. Let's call it, entities. Let's call it hives. Let's call it, energy centers, of building that within a larger dysfunctional idea of, nation, border, institution, et cetera. So making something old new that has the capacity to include all of the conflict and all of the possibility that's in that conflict. So there's much more to say about that, but it's so interesting hearing you, watching you do that. Natalie, tell us about some of the work you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, the center is fairly new, and it's a really lucky space and engagement, and to have been escalated by Mellon is again feels lucky, and I mean that in like a Mojave sense of arriving at this place of momentum. And in some ways, I feel like the work we're doing here is alongside the work that you all are doing, and part of it is trying to bring Indigenous knowledge systems to bear on these larger conversations that are happening, and some of that is about creating a relationship between on-res, off-res borderlands, in particular because of our proximity and our placement on the U.S.-Mexico border as an O'odham nation. And I think there's something like really important as well about the ways we're trying to operate within the institution and wondering what that means to make language, to make art in the institution. What does it mean to be public? What does it mean to be private? How do we take care of these relationships? And to bring Indigenous language, for example, like beneath all of these languages, like whether we start in the 1800s or the 1700s, beneath these languages are Indigenous languages and lexicons, which is why there is no wall. And the fact that language is prophetic, so we never built a wall. And so some of this is, opening up an Indigenous lens and saying there's a relationality we have with land and water and place. And it requires a certain practice of tending. What does that mean in a university setting? What does that mean in a philanthropic setting? What does it mean as artists for us to engage these topics? And who are the persons who are involved in these? And, I think something that's really interesting for us here is, ASU has one of the largest populations of Indigenous faculty in the country. And, so we have all of these borders of being on-res, off-res. How do we create that space and then transfer it over to say what's happening here on the border of the TO reservation on the Mexico side, on the United States side, is what's happening and has happened in South Africa. What's happening and has happened in Gaza and Palestine, in the Fatah area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. How do we kind of crack those languages open, those lexicons open, and put pressure on some of the things that we're talking about, such as public space? Like, what does that mean to open up a public space? What does it mean to say there is a before? What does that mean to say, when we're thinking about the future, we're actually returning to some of these older ways of doing? And I think some of it is a tension that does feel like a very important creativity, and I think like one example I might mean of the future having come through the past is, for example, Rafa Esparza does a lot of work with adobe and bricks, something given to him by his father. And the intentional practice of that, of handing that from one to the other, of putting your hands into the earth to make, and that as you share this knowledge, you can do this in Michigan, which is a place he's done this work, or you can do this in Tucson, or you can do this, on the other side of the border now, Prieta, but to put your hands in the earth there is a relationship and a practice of place. And yet we now have these 3D printers, which is another act of imagination, these 3D printers that are doing that work and creating these adobe mud structures without any of the relationship to the land. And so I think there's something about what we're doing here at the center that's very focused on language, but also using art and using artists to pressure scholarship into asking, like, why are we doing the work we're doing? How are we doing it? And what are we leaving behind for the people to continue building that we might not be able to carry back into the institution, or that we do carry back in and use it to disrupt the institution? So how to use that indigenous lens and open it up to this global machine, and to say what's happening here is happening everywhere. And now what will our next collective act be to engage it?
And in the midst of doing this work, also some of what you do is make poems. We asked if you would share a poem today, and it would be wonderful to hear it now. I'm thinking about the ways in which the self is borderless as well, right? I mean, I think that like we don't compartmentalize so neatly into the self who is now going to write a poem, the self who is now going to, knowing about other aspects of your work, talk to elders and gather language from them, the self who is going to set up a center for imagination in the Borderlands. It's all that self, but in different registers. So it would be great if you could share the poem that you brought.
Yeah, I mean, it's always lucky to be able to share a poem in front of the poet. So gracias, Elizabeth. This is the title poem, Maestra. This is the title poem of my most recent book, Post-Colonial Love Poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snakebite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started before those millennia ago, and onward those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse, always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. Leisure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wildflowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, lifting them in its copper current, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds on my shoulders, down my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose-horned rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers a 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Rise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again. Gracias for letting me share that.
Gracias a ti. You know, and I think there's many things to say there, but Fauna and Teddy, you might also have a response. But you know, knowing that poem and your poems very well, hearing different things in the context of today, you know, hearing all of the really close juxtapositions of the speaker and the speaker's body and the land, and you know, that absolute proximity and remembering that the speaker carries, and also seeing in proximity of some of the words, I was born by wage and I wage love. Excuse me, I'm not getting it absolutely perfectly, but it's like you just take that word wage right back. You say, no, I'm not going to leave it over there in this understanding. I'm gonna take it into another understanding. This is what I'm trying to say. So thinking about, you know, the languages that hurt us and limit us and define us and understand us not relative to what we come from, but rather to another larger system, and saying like, no, you know, this is who I am and we are, and the very land we come from and know intimately. There were some of the things that I was hearing in that great poem today relative to our conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, gracias. I mean, I think too, thinking about Fauna and Teddy's work, like, I think something that that is difficult when folks who are not from this area, or who do not have a familiarity with the area, is that there's a like, we will never get this right, and because the wall is the disruption. And yet all of the different ways we're going to have to collectively imagine what we might do together, and those tensions, those necessary tensions, you know, that we call, sometimes we call that reciprocity, which I believe is also a really beautiful and important, you know, tension. And so there, I think when I think a lot about Teddy's work, and then Teddy and Fauna's work together, like, the thing that has become really important for me as just a phrase is that whether it's speaking language, or whether it's being in a community, or whether it's trying to address or call out to, or advance or escalate conversations about the border, is that it's a difficult tension, but we have to understand that everything we say and do is of consequence. And we are of consequence to one another, and that consequence sometimes will work out differently for each of us than others. But the importance of that collective energy, building a momentum, you know, yeah. So I appreciate that generosity, but it's also been very generous to be alongside some of the projects that Teddy and Fauna have been working on, and the time I've been able to spend thinking toward them. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalie, for that. You know, one thing that just, your comments before you read the poem and then after the poem, the way institutions that govern our work in a formal way need to change to enable this kind of voice and this kind of collaboration to happen in regions like ours. You know, academic culture is filled with so many assumptions about where knowledge rests. Knowledge for institutions, academic institutions, rests in the lab, in the studio, on the campus. And too often engaging with communities in struggle, it's seen as a vertical gesture of descending down. And maybe listening, but then extracting and ascending back up. And how can we, you know, sort of tip that model to a horizontal plane of reciprocity and learning how to surrender and listen? And one of the things, you know, the idea of building trust with communities and not to trust institutions is a huge, huge task. And it doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come fast. And so I think the kind of work that we do is slow, whereas research timescales are very fast. A grant ends, a class ends, a course ends, students go, they disappear. And it's how to develop long, meaningful relationships that don't go away because funding dries up. This is why the Mellon Foundation has been so essential to the work that we're doing, because they're enabling us to build relationships over time and really push against conventional academic culture, which is vertical and fast.
Now, I can
Well, in that complete, I was just going to say that, like, one of the main disruptions that I think, I think the way that Mellon is injecting poetry, that intentionality of language places, and like resounding it through. I've never done more work in science and law departments as I have this past year. because people are interested in that intentional language. But also with your work and some of the work Mellon is making possible is the disruption is with land. Like that's where we're seeing one of the main disruptions is like land in place that is not property, or land in place that is disrupting capital in different ways. And that with you all's work and you know, that I think is something that the resoundings will continue long before we all might even be able to understand what it will mean.
And this, I was going to say that this disruption depends of, obviously, as we have been talking about, on refreshing our languages and our epistemologies. And often for us also it has been an issue of bringing our students to the very sites of conflict, to traverse the very environments where not only diversity is, where the issues are, bringing those issues back into the campus to help us reorganize our research priorities. But when I was listening to Natalie's words, I was thinking, my God, if some of our students could be hearing those words as they traverse the specificity of that environment, I believe, in fact, that war also is a political practice, is really enabling to contextualize the issues in very interesting ways. What I'm trying to say is that, yes, the power of language, but the power of performance through the territory and the curatorial framework by which the meeting of knowledges can happen. And at that point, just one last thing about this is, for us, it has been also to engage a project of visualization, that images are political tools to produce reciprocity, to incite a new sensibility of cross-border publics. And there was a video that we, prepared. I don't know if it was shown, but it was one image that we created that is called Mexus, where the jurisdictional line of the border, we eliminated. And instead of seeing the imposition of this political line, what we end up seeing and presenting to our partners in our discussions is the 8 most important regional watershed systems that are shared between the US and Mexico. And that's the image that should rally these cross-border publics to understand, or to raise awareness that it is our shared interests and common values in disrupted landscapes that really should be the basis for a new type of conversation about building trust and about producing reciprocity. So yeah, the power of images in capturing what otherwise at times is difficult to enact, is sort of more process-based dynamics, I think, that are embedded in the territory, but often very invisible. Just like poetry.
Yeah, and I think, and we're going to turn to the questions, but continuing to think about the specific power of poetry is that, when it's working as it should, the poet can never be afraid of one word touching another word. The poet cannot be afraid of what abuts. The
Exactly.
Poet is not there to transmit a specific meaning. The poet is there to transmit, kind of the meaning that's under the rock, the meaning that's in the water, right? And you may not know what it is saying explicitly, because that's not the job of the poem. The job of the poem is to carry it without fear for what it sounds like. And so I think in that regard, to what we're talking about breaking open, there is tremendous possibility. There are so many questions, and this is a very engaged village. So I'm going to start reading some out. This one comes from Ela in St. Louis. So often the border is characterized in terms of crisis and emergency in order to justify extreme necropolitical measures. What are some of the most effective strategies you've seen to counteract those narratives? And anybody can take the question so that we'll keep it moving and be able to put more on the table.
I'll just pop in quickly, and like something that I feel like is, the English language is in a state of emergency always. It hasn't imagined all of us, and it has imagined crises for us to fall into. And so for me, one of a really important practice is to bring my Indigenous language into a sentence of English or a space of English, such as the university, because I think there's something about the generosity and the resounding of Indigenous languages. Again, not just a kind of beforeness, but a way that the crisis is actually not ours, that our relationship with this land and this place and the ways we've learned to tend one another and to care for one another as a people and human species, as well as other life forms, that isn't actually in crisis. It's the state's language that has put those things in crisis. And so for me, one of the ways that it seems essential, and also not just when I say Indigenous, I don't just mean what we call Native. I mean, each one of us, our relationships and practices with tending our lands and waters, because those ultimately become the ways that we tend one another. So back to that idea of touch that you were saying, not to be afraid to abut, it's who we're next to, beloved or stranger, that we learn from the land. And so Indigenous languages carry that relationship in them. It hasn't been dislocated from it. So that would be one way I would meet, that generous question.
These counter narratives really should be, again, as we were discussing in that example of visualizing the invisible for a moment, to recognize it, is to really understand that the histories of these border regions have been primarily defined by hybrid identities and by flows that are invisible. People going in one direction, wasting another, the hydrological systems that really are shared. So this giving primacy to the socio-ecological dimension of what really at times unites us, if I may say, just for a moment, that our common sort of ground for often is not part of our, even though that's commonsensical, is not part of our everyday kind of public awareness or opinion. When we did this project with Antanas Mocus, the former mayor of Bogota, and we did a cross-border citizenship culture survey to understand whether there was a cross-border citizen or public. One thing that emerged in the survey that many people said, if I could visualize, if I could see, I could, if I could be brought to these environments and these issues, I could then rally for them. I can really be an advocate. So often I think we know, maybe academics, all of us, but I think it's surprising to understand that in general, many of those issues remain hidden. So I think that the counter narrative depends on new forms of visualization, new forms of engagement, new kind of meeting again of these knowledges through the spoken language, through performative practices, and through a variety of processes, I think.
Just to say one thing quickly about crisis. I mean, again, I think it's about taking back the language of crisis and trauma. I mean, we've just witnessed we've experienced a period in this region that, in many ways was unprecedented. There's been so much fear and anxiety in migrant communities along the border wall over the last half decade. And because of the proximity of the wall, extra legal deportations and just all kinds of shenanigans were going on in these neighborhoods, and people were justifiably afraid. And the narrative of trauma, right, needed to be embraced and understood. And the national language of crisis would continually overcome the experiences of people within these communities. And so, yes, this was a site of trauma and crisis, but for entirely different reasons than people were talking about and thinking about. So, it really needs to be said. We've lived through an unprecedented period in border neighborhoods over the last half a decade, and it'll take time to heal. from the deportations and the fear of the knock at the door in the middle of the night. So.
And actually, a question that kind of flows out of what we're discussing is from Adam Strom, who asks, what do you wish all young people knew and understood about the border? What would you want them to do with that knowledge and understanding? And I like that straightforward question, thinking also about, you know, it's a big place. We stand on a very gigantic landmass. So if you live across the country, if you live, there are so many things that you might not understand. What would be something that you wish all young people understood? And what would they do with it?
Well, that it's not inevitable. You know, it wasn't inevitable, it didn't have to be, and it still isn't inevitable. I think that's, I think this speaks to something Teddy mentioned early on, was just this 30-foot tall wall. The cement, to see the militarization, the big giant lights that they shine down, the sound they make. I mean, these were the same materials they took to Standing Rock to intimidate those protests. It was the same exact lighting systems, the same, but I think the most important thing is for us to keep reminding them that these are man-made objects. These are objects. They're not relationships, and that it's still, even though the wall is there, the wall itself is not inevitable. And I think that that feels like a really important place to meet them in what we know as an imagination we can't even anticipate yet, the imaginations of these younger artists and writers and poets and dreamers yet. So
that's beautiful.
I would say that they are the cross-border citizens of the future. This is what we keep arguing, mainly after, by the way, these last years of criminalizing children. A lot of our focus has been on really engaging youth in many of these environments. One of the environments we work in is this informal settlement in Tijuana that crashes against the border wall. 100,000 people live in it. Informality and precarity defines it. Lack of water waste infrastructure. It is at a higher elevation than the estuary on the San Diego side. So a lot of the trash and pollution from the informal settlement unfortunately ends up damaging the lungs of our bioregion. So when we engage youth there, we always talk about this, that somebody that might throw a piece of plastic or trash on the creek inside the informal settlement might be damaging the livability and the environmental health of their own community. But if they also think that will end up in the estuary on the other side, which is part of the other, right? And part of our action here is to protect that environmental asset that is shared. So this connection between our local conditions and somehow through this expanding out across scales, understand that we need to take care of the other, that our neighbor and ourselves need to really come together because our destinies are intertwined. So that sensibility is, I think, what should, when we talk to youth and to our students, this is what we would hope that they are thinking about. This is the new generation that will be hopefully more empathetic, that will understand that democracy is not the right to be left alone, but in fact it's an act of coexistence with others. That's really what we would love for them to know. I'm sure they already know. They already know.
Yeah,
I
was going to say. I mean, what that opens up is also like what are young folks teaching us, which is of course implicit in the question. And then someone is asking a great question. Cassie Tanks, who is studying in Chapel Hill, asks, have you collaborated with librarians or archivists in the area? How does that collaboration look? How would you like to expand it? If you have not, what would your ideal collaboration look like? And what types of projects or community efforts do you see librarians and archivists supporting? So there's a lot there.
Well, Mellon funded a really incredible, everything is moving always back to the nexus of Mellon, the new the new Center of Imagination, I believe. But there was, for example, a community archive program that happened through our ASU library, which was really beautiful. And it came with its own set of kind of like a box, an archival box with materials in it that were designed for folks to take back into their community. So again, like how to dislocate those typical traditions of extraction that the archive has been. And so thinking about, that is one direct example of how the archive has worked and how our librarians have, turned that around. And we have some centers, or we have some students here in the center who are, they're calling it an almanac. And they're thinking about Leslie Silko's Almanac of the Dead was the book they read that spurred this, but their thesis project is an almanac that moves from here, from Nogales, Tucson, Phoenix, covering the whole area. But it's, young people, young writers and poets working with their elders and even their non-elders, right? Because I think that's the current archive. Like we're saying, our young people are building the language we yet need. And so those are some ways that we're seeing it happen here that have been really lucky to watch and be a part of.
Beautiful.
We haven't formally
yes, Fauna.
we haven't worked formally with librarians or archivists, but we very much see the community stations as a kind of cross-border observatory where new knowledge can be co-produced and archived and shared. And so we're really interested in documenting, right, invisible flows through dialogue and storing those and making them accessible to future conversations and dialogues. So the idea of archiving is very important to us. Archiving experience.
Leslie Finney in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, asks a question: is there any sign, hope for bipartisan work on immigration reform? What is the low-hanging fruit that both sides could support? And what I would just add to that is like, okay, you all make the rules, so let's just blow it open. And what would be some of the most extraordinary things we could imagine at the governmental level that would be positive?
So the political scientist in me jumps out. One thing we've realized working in this region for a long time now is that the sort of ethical imperatives of working together to solve shared challenges only really influences a small subset of the population. Most people go on with their daily lives. They're busy, they're preoccupied, they look away from one another. And so realized that when communicating with certain audiences, and policymakers are among them, you have to speak in the language of interest, which doesn't come naturally to us necessarily, but speaking in the language of interest, that failing to work together on issues that are marked by flow and porosity and interdependence only hurts oneself. Right. The border wall harms the border wall builder sometimes more than it hurts those they're trying to blockade. And so we've learned how to speak a language of environmental shared interests, for example, that if South San Diego County cares about clean beaches and clean water, they might want to think about partnering with people on the other side of the wall and working together on these challenges. And so we find ourselves modulating our language depending on who we're speaking with. Sometimes it's a language of care and cultural sort of optimism, and sometimes it's just a naked language of exchange and interest, and the language of the politician.
May I say for a moment that require new processes of political representation where artists, where some of us in the humanities can really translate the hidden knowledge again, embedded in the best practices of migrant communities. We would have to begin there, which is a very difficult, maybe polarizing topic, but speaking of the positive impact of immigrants in transforming the American neighborhood, So for us has been a process of translating objectively, really, the relevance of the many bottom-up urban practices in order to produce new type of public policy. So for example, in many of the workshops that we've conducted throughout the years, we began to redefine what density means. Density is not just an amount of objects per area. Once one resident said, in fact, density should be an amount of social exchanges per area. Zoning or land use cannot just be a punitive tool to prevent socialization, but in fact, it should be a very smart framework to organize local activity and local economy. In other words, to produce a new political language with new methods of political representation so that institutions, left and right, across the aisle, can understand that the survivability of the individual depends on the health of the collective, and in that sense, really invest in the city through new types of models. And that's the reason these environments have the DNA to give us that future, but it has been misunderstood. And so I think there needs to be a lot of translation, a lot of engagement to really intervene in public opinion, which has been hijacked so awfully in the last year.
Well, and some of that language exists in, I believe exists in tribal courts. You know, it's a place of pressure that can really tremble our government policies, is the way, because we were, you know, tribal courts were given United States structures, but still managed to hold our values in it and are still managing to hold some of those values that do tremble back up and shake these political systems and these political structures. And I think importantly, the relationship between Black indigeneity, indigenous Blackness, and land, and I think there's a relationship there, you know. And I mean, I don't know how bipartisan this can be, because I think in some ways people are split about whether, you know, what sovereignty is and things like that. But I do think those languages exist, and those communities have existed, and those whether you want to call them solidarities or families or communities have existed. And I think there are those languages that exist there in tribal courts, but also in the history of Black and Indigenous relationality.
Well, we are just about at time. This has been an amazing conversation that we could keep on having, and I am so grateful to each of you for who you are, for coming today, for what you bring, what you do in your work, what you brought to this conversation. I am so grateful to all of the people out there. I mean, I've really never seen so much very, very deeply engaged and resourceful and curious and heartful conversation. So I know we didn't get to every question, but thank you all for coming. Our next event, which I know you're all going to come to and bring your friends, is an afternoon with Joy Harjo. So she will be with us for a conversation on March the 21st at 4 p.m. That's what's coming next. So gracias a todos, and a wonderful, wonderful end of the day. Thank you.
Gracias,
Thank
Elizabeth.
you.
Gracias, Natalie.